Okay, welcome to this video on a bit of genetic cross practice based on some inherited disorders, and we're going to do how sex is inherited. So hopefully you'll be able to complete genetic cross diagrams to predict phenotypes of offspring, use ratios to express these outcomes, and finally be able to construct our own genetic crosses based on inherited disorders. So here is the specification link, and then there's also the links to the caboodle parts there. So our first thing we're going to look at is dominant diseases. So a dominant disease is caused by a dominant allele. So remember, dominant alleles are represented by capital letters. Only one copy needs to be present for the disease to show. So we can either have a heterozygous genotype, where we have one dominant allele, or a homozygous dominant genotype, where we have two of the dominant alleles. In both of these scenarios, the dominant disease will show. The example that you need to know about is polydactyly. So polydactyly is where a person has extra digits on their hands or feet, or both, and it's caused by a dominant allele. And it's also quite common in some species of cats. So let's construct the genetic cross then for polydactyly. So we're going to use capital F for this. You might be given capital P or lowercase p, but we're going to use F because it's a little bit clearer. So the question says that if a person who is heterozygous for the polydactyly gene has a child with another person who is homozygous recessive, what are the chances that their child will have polydactyly? In this example, we're given the genotypes, but you should be able to recognise them as well. Heterozygous, one dominant, one recessive. Homozygous recessive, homo being the same, and then recessive being two copies of the recessive allele. So first we fill them in. Remember that we do this as sperm and egg. If I go to the next slide quickly, you should be able to see that we have our sperm and egg here. The sperm from the male can be either dominant or recessive because the father is heterozygous, but the female's eggs can only be recessive because she is homozygous recessive. So in meiosis, when we divide the two cells, one allele goes to one of the gametes and one goes to the other. So then you just connect them as if sperm meets egg. So the sperm meets this egg, it would be dominant and recessive, or heterozygous. Here we have a recessive sperm meeting a recessive egg, so it's homozygous recessive. Here we have a dominant sperm meeting a recessive egg, so it's heterozygous. And then finally here we have two recessives, so this one is going to be homozygous recessive. We're then asked, what is the expected ratio of offspring with polydactyly? So we'll do the ratio of polydactyly to not polydactyly. So dominant to recessive. Well, our expected ratio will be any that have a dominant F or a dominant polydactyly gene to any that don't. Because it's a dominant disease, if they have one copy of this dominant allele, it will show. So we can see here that we have two genotypes in the offspring that would have polydactyly, out of a total of 4. So it would be 2 out of 4, or 2 to 2. So our ratio is 2 with polydactyly to 2 without polydactyly. Simplifying that ratio, 1 to 1. A recessive disease now is caused by a recessive allele. And the recessive disease we're going to talk about is cystic fibrosis. But the key thing to note here is that 2 copies of that recessive allele must be present. Because if just one copy of the dominant gene is present, it will overpower the recessive allele, and therefore the disease won't show. So this time, we'll use capital A to represent our dominant still. But then we have 2 recessive alleles would result in cystic fibrosis. If you have one dominant allele, the disease won't be present. So what is cystic fibrosis? It's a build-up of thick mucus in the lungs. It's a disease of the cell membrane. It affects how ions move across a membrane, and therefore we have a thick build-up of mucus in certain airways. It can also affect the reproductive system, such as the fallopian tubes, causing the egg to have a harder time getting through, resulting in infertility. And there we go again, it's a recessive disease, so 2 copies of that recessive allele must be present in order for someone to have cystic fibrosis. So here we have a cross for cystic fibrosis. It says that a person who is heterozygous for the gene has a child with a person who is also heterozygous. Fill in the genetic cross for the offspring. And again in this question, we are given the genotypes of the parents. The paternal side is heterozygous, dominant recessive, and the maternal side is heterozygous, dominant recessive. So we can fill this in. Remember, sperm from the male meets egg from the female. So here we have homozygous dominant. Here we have heterozygous. Here we have heterozygous again. And finally in this one, we have homozygous recessive. In this question, however, we're asked to give the percentage, not a ratio, of offspring would you expect to have the disease. So how many of these would have the disease? So if it's a recessive disease, which cystic fibrosis is, then there has to be 2 copies present for the disease to show in the phenotype. So the only one in which there is not a dominant allele is this one here. So we have 1 out of a total of 4 possible genotypes that would be cystic fibrosis. 1 out of 4, a quarter, is equal to 25%. We're now going to talk a little bit about sex inheritance. So here, we're told that the 23rd pair of chromosomes determines sex in an organism, and that's in humans. So other organisms have different amounts of chromosomes. You might be told in a test that an organism's 46th pair of chromosomes, for example, as different organisms have different number of chromosomes. But in animals, and in humans in particular, we're talking about X or Y chromosomes on that 23rd pair. Males have 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. Females have 2 X chromosomes. So the possible gametes that can be produced in males are an X sperm or a Y sperm, as during meiosis, those chromosomes, the X and Y, split off into 2 separate sperm cells. In females, however, they can only produce X eggs. So the female eggs are X and X. We can then start to construct a genetic cross for this. We have the paternal gametes, being the sperm, combining with the maternal gametes, being the eggs. So we have an X with an X, X with a Y, X with an X there, and an X with a Y there. So those are our possible genotypes of the offspring. We're then asked, what is the ratio of male to female in the expected offspring? Well, 2 of these are XX, so will be female, and 2 of them are XY, and therefore will be male. So we have a ratio of 1 to 1. We could say 2 to 2, but as before, we can simplify that to 1 to 1. If 2 parents have 6 children, how many of them would you expect to be male? Well, if it's 1 to 1, then it'll be 50%, so 3. 2 parents have 3 children, they are all girls. Now, friends say they are due a boy. Why is this incorrect? So this is something a lot of people say, is that, if you have 3 children of the same sex in a row, then the next one is more likely to be the other. But that's not correct. The chance is always 50%. And the thing is, it's 50% for every child. That's the thing that often confuses people. So it's a 50% chance of being male or female for every single child. And that's the next question. Explain why people may think this is the case. Because if it's 50-50 or if it's a 1-to-1, you'd expect them to have, if they have 4 children, you'd expect 2 boys and 2 girls. Remember, 50% for every child. So we then have a question here on constructing a genetic cross. So this is higher tier content. If you're not doing higher, you won't be expected to construct one, but it is helpful to be able to do. So we're told in this question that disease A is recessive. A person with disease A and a person who is heterozygous for the disease have a child. Construct a genetic cross and give the chance of the child having disease A as a percentage. So first off, let's look at the information we're given. So disease A is recessive. Let's use the letter A as our alleles. A, capital, will then be dominant, and a lowercase a is recessive. There are two alleles. We're told that a person with disease A has a person who is heterozygous, but let's look at that person first. With disease A. If disease A is recessive, what's the only possible genotype that they could have? Well, if there's a dominant allele, they won't have the disease. So this person here, let's draw a little arrow, will be homozygous recessive, lowercase, lowercase. This person over here, however, is heterozygous. Now, hetero, if you remember, means different. So this time, this person has dominant recessive, heterozygous. That's the part that's different from the foundation course where you won't be asked to interpret that. You have to know that this person would be homozygous recessive and this person, they tell you, is heterozygous. So then let's get rid of that and we can construct our cross. So the person who is homozygous recessive can go here. It doesn't matter which side they go on. And the person who is heterozygous can go here, dominant recessive. What we can then do is combine those in a genetic cross and say that this person here, well, this genotype would be heterozygous because we're combining a dominant with a recessive. This person would be heterozygous. This person here would be homozygous recessive, lowercase, lowercase, and the same as this person, lowercase, lowercase. So this is our genetic cross done. Then we're asked to give the chance of a person having disease A as a percentage. Disease A is recessive, so as we said before, the only possible genotype that would result in disease A is homozygous recessive. There's no dominant allele to overpower it. So which ones are homozygous recessive? This one here, and also this one there. So 2 out of a total of 4, we could write that as 2/4 would be AA, or sorry about that, the video seems to have crashed due to a terrible maths error. So where were we? We said that 2 out of 4 will have disease A, which is the same as half having disease A, which is 50% chance of the child having disease A. Right, back to it. So here we have a question on polydactyly as a dominant disease, and I'll show it on your screen now. We're told that the man's mother also has polydactyly, but his father does not. The man is heterozygous for polydactyly. Explain how the information given above shows that the man is heterozygous. So the information we need to look at here is his parents. So it says that his mother has polydactyly, but his father does not. We need to work our way back, see what information we have, and then figure out why he's heterozygous. Well, if it's a dominant disease, then to have polydactyly, you just have to have 1 copy. So this father who does not have polydactyly must have no copies. So let's use P. So they will be PP, homozygous recessive. If that's the case, then to have polydactyly, the man must have got the dominant allele from his mother. So that would be our marks there. The dominant allele comes from the mother, and the recessive allele comes from the father, because there's only one possible allele that he can get from his father, which would be a recessive allele. So the man has inherited polydactyly from the mother, and he's inherited the normal or the recessive allele from his father. Because the father does not have polydactyly, then the father must be homozygous recessive. That's the key part there, is noticing that the father must be homozygous recessive. Okay, pause the video here and have a go at the question that's on the board. Right, let's go through that question now. So, a gene is made up of a substance called DNA. Genes are found on chromosomes, and most human cells contain 23 pairs of chromosomes. Remember, they have 23 pairs but 46 individual chromosomes. In females, the two sex chromosomes are XX, but in males, the two sex chromosomes are XY. Alleles are alternative forms of a gene. Two healthy parents can sometimes have a child with a genetic disorder such as cystic fibrosis. This is because cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive allele. The two parents are healthy because they also have a dominant allele. Remember, they only need one copy of the dominant allele for the disease not to show, because cystic fibrosis is recessive. Thank you, sir. What an excellent revision video. Well done for completing it. If you have any questions, ask your teacher via email or in class. And keep up the great work.